Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Packed house, which I think is a tribute to our very long-standing contributor to ConHome. I'm having to get used to saying this out loud. I'm Giles Dilnot. I am the editor of ConservativeHome. And I was thinking, how do we mark the fact that His Lordship, Dan as I have him in my phone, has been writing for ConHome for 10 years. And I thought, well, we should definitely do something on the site. And I thought, conference is coming. And I know he and I can fill time. We can definitely do 40 minutes because we once had a conversation about China, which we'll come to. And I was sitting in the car in the Marks and Spencer's car park, and we talked so long, I got a parking fine. So we can definitely do this together. I'm really, really pleased that you're here. We've got a packed room, and that you could do this. You sent me the first article, and it was somewhat prophetic. A subject that you are known for discussing, but nonetheless, it was quite prophetic. 2014, and it's about our relationship with Europe.
Yeah. Well, it's lovely to be here, and it's really special to have been a ConservativeHome columnist for 10 years. I've very much enjoyed every day of it. Tim Montgomery, my first editor, with the brilliant idea of having this startup very, very early in spotting how the new technology had changed the media landscape. And then Paul Goodman, who had been my boss when I was a lead writer at the Telegraph and is now in the House of Lords. And now Giles, who, as he says, I've got into trouble with the old Bill on previous occasions. And I mean, I don't think many ConHome contributors do it for the money. Right? We do it because and I think this is something
that hasn't changed, by the way, just in case you're thinking.
We do it, first of all, because we want to be part of something that is worth being part of, right? It's nice to belong to the club, if you like. But also, I worked out when I was still in politics that if you wanted to speak to Conservatives, you would reach more people on this medium than even writing an article in the Telegraph. It was a very early example of targeted messaging. And even now, I'm not sure that everyone in politics has worked out what that means. So it really, I can't believe it's been 10 years. Lovely to see a number of my old friends from my time in the European Parliament and constituents, and indeed older friends than that in the room. So thank you all for coming. It's what a special day.
Do you remember who introduced us?
I think it was when you were still at the BBC, weren't you?
Still at the BBC.
And you did a piece
from Strasbourg.
Wasn't it about how social media were changing the media landscape?
Something like that. But do you remember who it was?
No.
Nigel Farage.
How funny. How funny. Well, actually, that is, I think, that is of some relevance to the first article I wrote. Okay, so the piece that you were kind enough to reference there was an article I wrote exactly 10 years ago about why you should vote Conservative, because the only way that we were going to get a referendum and therefore get out of the EU was through a Conservative government. Now, obviously there'll be people in this room who were against Brexit. Fine, it was a fair vote. But I'm going to address my remarks now to a different category of people, which is the people who in 2014, and they were very vocal, were saying, how can you be so naive? Why don't you join UKIP? Is it cowardice? Are they giving you money? All the usual things that, I always loved the idea that you somehow got a bonus for being a Tory MP rather than a UKIP one, but we'll leave that to one side. When I tried to explain that maybe they disagreed, but that I thought the only way that this was actually going to happen would be through the election of a Tory government, I would get an explosion of rage. And this wasn't just sort of online trolling, this was from people in real life, face to face. How can you pretend to believe that? Cameron will never give us a referendum. If he does, it'll be rigged, blah, 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 blah. Obviously, that didn't happen. We got the referendum, and while my UKIP friends were fulminating about it, I was getting on with setting up Vote Leave. I just mentioned this because I've detected that I'm getting exactly the same response from the same kinds of people, and in some cases from the same people. Why don't you join Reform? Why are you being such... And I bet you some of you get it where you live, right? Why are you sticking with these Lib Dem wannabes, et cetera, et cetera? And my answer is, well, guys, sorry, we had this conversation 10 years ago. I'm still waiting for the apology then. Who called that one right? If we are serious about delivering the kinds of policies that we want, that we all agree are necessary, and less wokery and less illegal immigration and lower taxes and all the rest of it, the only path to doing that is by electing a majority of the House of Commons dedicated to those principles. And my biggest worry at the moment, as it was then, is that a divided right is going to let Labour maintain a majority despite a very small share of the popular vote.
It was interesting when Nigel Farage introduced me, Dan, he was definitely fishing for Dan to join UKIP. But he also said to me, I said, why don't, I think Roger Natman might have been leader at the time. And he said, I said, well, you obviously want to or should lead UKIP, don't you think? And he said, no. My only interest is having a show on LBC.
I realise now that I was in a much smaller minority than I was aware of at the time in just being primarily interested in Brexit. Only now do I realise how many people involved in the pro-leave movement were actually interested in careers beyond the EU. When we left, I thought, that's it, you get to retire. How often in my line of work do you get to quit on your own terms? I thought, this is, mission accompli, as we old Brussels hands say, right? And I'd started teaching. I was very surprised when I got a call from Boris offering me a place back in Parliament. But I had thought that more people would be like me and would say, this is what I came for, time to get a dog and enjoy life. But actually, very few people did. For a lot of people, I now realise there was a certain anti-systemic anger that was intrinsic, and it happened pre-2016 to be focused on the EU, and it's now just shifted and found a different target.
You mentioned Boris said you want a place in Parliament, but that's the funny thing. You've sort of never given the impression you want to be captured. It was like you could have done it. Why not? Why not an MP? Why did you not want it?
I mean, I was in this for Brexit, and when that happened, I thought it's time to move on. I wasn't brave enough to say no when Boris offered me a peerage. I say offered. I mean, this is Boris, so I had to kind of read between the lines of what he was actually saying. Anyone who's ever had the
Boris for you. What
do they call this now? He was, everything is going terrifically well, badly or well, yes. And eventually you have to say, Boris, are you saying what I think you're saying? Yes. So, but having said that, I don't want to, in any sense, sound as it were blasé about it. I mean, it's a terrific privilege, and it's one that I've tried to take seriously. I try to turn up as often as I can and speak.
So you're doing that in the upper chamber, but you never seem to want to do the MP thing. And I'm just intrigued in hooking out. Was that for you not something that delivered a platform for you to get the things that you wanted? I mean, as Brexit's happened, there's still a lot to do on that subject.
I mean, I was talking to somebody last night, a young person here at conference who was 17, and was saying, what should I do? Should I read politics? What should I do afterwards, and so on. And I said, if I had my life again, I think the single biggest mistake I made was going into politics too early. I was 27 when I was elected. And the reason I did it is that I was at the Telegraph at the time, working for Paul Goodman and Charles Moore ultimately. I hadn't planned to go into politics, but Blair had just won the 97 election. We all forget this now, on a platform of taking us into the euro and scrapping all of the other opt-outs. His last conference speech as leader of the opposition before the 97 election, he said, under my leadership, Britain will never be isolated or left behind in Europe. He was going to sign us up to the whole thing. Now, we did not know then, as we know now, that if Tony Blair told you that today was Monday, you would double check. Right? So I thought, oh my word, this is happening now, all hands on deck. And, then 5 years on, obviously we hadn't had this definitive referendum, but by then we were into the rows about the European Constitution and the Lisbon Treaty, and it always looked as though it was just on the point of happening. In the end, of course, nearly 20 years later, it did. Now, in retrospect, wish I'd spent those 20 years, or some of them, doing something else. So this is a roundabout way of answering your question. But what I said to this 17-year-old kid yesterday was, nobody should want to be a politician. Nobody should want the lifestyle of a politician. If you do, you need your head examined. It's a terrible, terrible life. The pay is not what you could be getting elsewhere. You have 100% scrutiny on everything. No one recognizes your privacy, and you're assumed to be a crook. You know, and there's this weird convention where the rest of the public are allowed to be rude to you, but you may never respond in kind. I'm not sure there's any other job in the world quite like that. So nobody should aspire to live that way. You may feel that you need to do this because there's something that you want to get done. And if that's the case, then none of the downsides will matter. If at the end of the day, you go home and you say, do you know what, I made that happen. Or, even better, I stopped that from happening, which is usually then it doesn't matter. Then you can take all the stress and the invasions of privacy, but if you want to do this as a career, you're not going to be happy. And I think we both know, and I suspect a lot of you in this room know of MPs in their late 50s and 60s who aren't really happy, treading water, have become effectively unemployable elsewhere, and are stuck because they've lost whatever ideological impulse led them in the first place. And that's not something you should ever want to do.
I went into government for 2 years, aged 52, and I got to say that's got its problems as well. With a 5-year-old, it is a thankless task, but an important one. But having some experience and not being a 26-year-old spad had some distinct advantages when trying to get things done. And if we're ever in the privileged position of being in government again, I would argue very strongly that they relook at the structure.
Well, I think we need all. This is a really unpopular thing to say, but if we're looking at candidates, yes, we need some local councillors, and yes, we need grandees from outside politics, but we do need one or two spads who know their way around Whitehall and know how to get things past civil servants, right? If you're selecting your cricket 11, you don't have 11 left-handed spin bowlers. You've got to have a diversity, and that means having some space for the people who are always decried as professional politicians. And I say that only because in the run-up to the last election, we were overwhelmingly selecting either local councillors or people who were prominent in their local associations. Now, individually, that makes sense. In a tough year, when you are worried about holding what has previously been a safe seat, it absolutely makes sense to choose a proven campaigner. But if you lose sight of the balance of your first 11, if you have a party that is only councillors, then, apologies to the many councillors I can see in front of me, nothing will get built. Right? No major projects of any kind, because almost every councillor went into politics to stop something, right? And so we do need to look at the diversity of our parliamentary team.
Yeah, it struck me. One of the things that I never ever shouted at a civil servant, but I tell you what, the value in its crudest possible terms of going, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. And being 53 and being able to say that, it really worked. It really worked. This brings me on to an article right up to date that I read of yours on ConHome, I think, or the Telegraph, never sure which when I'm talking with you, that really fascinated me, and now it has come to pass, we are in opposition, was be careful what you promise in opposition. And this really rang true with me. After 2 years of government, hearing everybody say you failed to deliver these things, knowing I was working every single day, 24/7, trying to get stuff done, there seems to be a fundamental problem with the way we do business for politicians, and that is, it cannot be, but it often is the answer when you're trying to move policy. You go, the Secretary of State, we'd love to do that, and we will summon every sinew to get that done, but if I can just bring in John over there, he's going to tell you that if we do it, we'll get taken to court and we'll lose, or this is going to be incredibly complicated. And it's like, tell me when It isn't complicated. That's the nature of government, which Labour are now finding out for themselves.
Yeah, or most commonly, good idea, leave that with me, and then nothing happens.
Yeah.
I mean, they are brilliant at stopping stuff.
It was Michael Heseltine who said to me that if you, the thing with the civil service is you have to say, can we get this done? Absolutely. And then you have to have a meeting the next week going, can I have a progress report on what happened? Oh, you really meant it? Okay. And you had to show them that you meant, when we said we want that done, we want that done.
I had this, I mean, it's a trivial, but for precisely that reason, telling example. When we left the EU, we inherited the EU's quotas and tariffs, including on stuff we don't really produce ourselves, right? So we had inherited these tomato tariffs, right? Now, I am aware that we do have a short tomato season in this country. The Isle of Wight used to be in my constituency, right? But even when we are producing tomatoes ourselves at the height of summer, we're still importing most of them, right? We don't have the climate. Now, and anyway, the Moroccan season, which is where we import almost all of our stuff from, it does not overlap by a single day with ours. So why were we imposing tariffs when we had a shortage? Do you remember the shortage last year, the great tomato shortage? And exactly as Giles says, I acted out this little play repeatedly where I would say to the minister in Parliament, by pre-arrangement, will he update us on where we are? And he would say, yes, please ask me that because I want to again put it in the... And he would say at the dispatch box, my officials have assured me that this is going to happen. And of course, it still hasn't, right? And I think ultimately, in many cases, including this one, the reason that they didn't want to change stuff is because they wanted to keep the door ajar for Starmer to take us back into some kind of customs arrangement with the EU, and therefore they didn't want to diverge from EU standards or trade schedules because that would only make the eventual reapproximation more complicated. Now, how much is that the fault of the politicians and how much is it the fault of the civil servants? Well, we could have a lot more than 40 minutes just on that, but I think the balance has tilted. When they made Yes Minister, Humphrey and Hacker were roughly, sometimes Hacker would win a round and sometimes Humphrey would. You know what I mean? They were evenly balanced. That is not true today. There is a huge imbalance that comes from the fact that Hacker cannot promote or demote Humphrey, whereas Humphrey knows that to get rid of Hacker, all he has to do is let it be known that Hacker has bullied him. Right? And then immediately the Prime Minister will panic and fire Hacker before the headlines get any worse. Right? And we've seen that happen repeatedly to people in the last government. So I think we fundamentally need to rethink how we will get stuff done. Is it by the Australian method of bringing in a lot more of your own people, giving ministers far more power to promote and demote, or at least bring in the top ranks and their own offices in the civil service? Do we need to move towards something even more radical and more of a separation of power? I'm open to all sorts of ideas. But this is always an unpopular thing to say. When people say, why is it that, wokery is so widespread after 14 years of Tory government, or why haven't we been able to control our borders, or why is tax and spending so high? The answer that ministers are aware they can't give because it makes them sound so pathetic is it would have been way worse had we not been there and had the permanent functionariat just concentrated completely on DEI, which is all they really want to do, right? Why did we not control our borders? Well, we actually have passed some of the, without question, the tightest laws on illegal migration that we've ever had in this country. But if those laws are repeatedly thwarted in the implementation, both by Home Office officials and then by the judiciary, obviously people see that the numbers keep rising. And unless you've really been up close to Whitehall and you've seen this dynamic, your natural reaction is going to be, oh, the Tories are useless, they didn't really try. Right? So this is why we need, if we don't fix this before we legislate for anything else, any future government is going to end up like the last one, impotent and therefore in the end despised, because it's an inversion of Kipling's quip about the prerogative of the harlot, right? That the minister has responsibility without power. He is blamed for things that he can't control because they're controlled by arm's length institutions. And the public is partly also responsible for this because we have this weird doublethink where we want a more powerful standing bureaucracy, right? The easiest way to get a round of applause if you're on question time or any questions is to say about any subject, This is too important to be a political football. Why can't we just get the politicians out of the picture and let the experts get it? Right? Well, that's what causes all the problems that we're then complaining about, right? Well, we all love the idea of the expert. We all love the idea of the independent, disinterested kind of academic who can see through the partisan scrum and somehow describe the true national interest. But I have to tell you, my friends, no such person exists, right? Everybody has their assumptions. Everybody has their prejudices. And the expert, by the way, more than most, if by expert we mean someone who's spent their whole life in one career, they're the last person that you should put in charge of invigilating that career, right? So this is why, but we do have this doublethink, and we really saw it, particularly during the pandemic. We kept on saying, get the politicians out of the way, and then complaining furiously about failings of the NHS or Public Health England or whatever it was. And to maintain the doublethink, do you know what we did? I spotted this all the way through the pandemic. Whenever the NHS screwed up on procurement or on testing or on what, it was always referred to as the government, right? Because I suppose it technically is, right? But the only way that the media can make this narrative palatable to the public is to suggest that somehow Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock were saying, how do we take PPE away from nurses? And that allowed us to go out and applaud cretinously every Thursday, while at the same time complaining about the outcomes.
And do you think there's another thing going on in that, as a public, we still believe the state should and can do all sorts of things long since outstripping what it's actually capable of?
We've reached saturation point in this country. Almost any additional function that the government takes on, it will do badly, because it can't discharge anything like its existing responsibilities, let alone take on new ones. And yet we're in this doom loop where the worse it does, the more people say, let's nationalise more stuff and let's get the politicians out of the way and let's have more quangos and spend more money on it. The most depressing poll I saw recently was that 60-something% of people wanted to nationalise Ticketmaster. Right. This is half of our heart is in Havana, right? We are proposing policies way, way, way to the left of anything we've seen under recent Labour governments. And I think, why is this happening? A big part of the answer is the lockdown. I think the lockdown and the associated spending altered the relationship between state and citizen, convinced people that there was unlimited resource, and made people, flicked switches in our brains, changed our chemistry as threats of that kind do, just made us more demanding of the smack of firm government. It's a bit like a war in that sense. It leads to a big expansion of state power. But also, I think our party in office was a little bit cowardly. We would repeatedly take the line of least resistance, which usually involved spending more, or at least deferring possible cuts. And the reason why that has become so common is in itself very interesting. I wonder whether it has to do with social media and the instantaneousness of everything, which makes it much harder for a politician to sustain short-term unpopularity in pursuit of long-term prosperity. I was very struck during the quasi-Kwarteng budget that I did not meet one MP who thought that cutting the top rate tax was economically bad as a decision. They all accepted that at that level the Laffer curve worked, and that we would end up with more revenue if we cut the rate. But with very few exceptions, they all fretted about what they called the optics of it. Now, the difference between the Thatcher and Lawson governments and now, I think has a lot to do with the slower news cycle of those days. It allowed politicians the luxury of saying, I do not care about the unpopularity of this policy when it is polled in isolation. What interests me is the popularity of the effect of this policy once we've done it. And at the end of the 4 years, you get your chance to decide whether you like the package. Now, and people did, right? Every one of Margaret Thatcher's privatisations was hugely unpopular until it happened. Every single one, like 70+% opposing it. So actually, incredibly, were the tax rises. So was the abolition of exchange control. People are very change averse, and people are very statist in their prejudices. And we all tend to lead with our gut and then rationalise backwards from there. But she had the courage and the vision to understand that if you did these things, although they were individually unpopular, the country would be better off and you would be re-elected. And that's what I think we need to somehow get back to. And now there's a big conversation about how we do that. I don't think a political party on its own can do that. I think it is asking too much of a political party to simultaneously to create the demand for something and to position itself as the beneficiary of that demand. You need to have an ecosystem around it. You need to have other people helping it make the argument. But definitely we are in a very left-wing moment on economics. We're quite right-wing moment on immigration and law and order and so on, but a very, very far left moment on economics, and we need to go back and challenge some of the assumptions.
And might it be a good idea for whichever new leader it is to start articulating, we've been selling you a pup for a while, all of us, not just Conservatives, Labour have been doing it, they're discovering it right now, is there are lots of things government cannot and should not do, and we're going to tell you what those are. Just get used to it. The idea that the state can do all of these things simply is not true, and that honesty might actually benefit us. Now, you have got a new role.
Well, just on that, I'll tell you about the new role, but just on that, when we introduced the lockdown measures, there was a responsibility to rescue our own victims. If you prevent someone from working, you have to compensate them. But I don't think we had thought through either the direct cost of that. I think there's a massive amnesia in the electorate, and a big part of why we lost the election so badly is that people had forgotten the cost of the lockdown measures that in most cases they were demanding themselves. So the idea that you can pay people to stay home for the better part of 2 years without significant price rises and tax rises in consequence is for the birds, and yet very few people were prepared to talk about it. And do you remember in the first leaders' televised debate, Rishi made this point about, he was asked about NHS waiting lists, and he said, well, look, we've been through this pandemic, but it's much less bad in Conservative-run England than in Labour-run Wales. And everyone groaned because they don't want to be reminded of the pandemic. They don't want to be reminded of the lockdown measures that they were insisting on and whose abolition they opposed. It's much easier to say, why have we got these price rises? The idea that we were borrowing from our future selves for 2 years and we were going to have to pay the money back is an unpopular one. And that, I think, ties in with a lot of other things. Yes, there are lots of things the government shouldn't do much harder in that climate, right? If Boris had even been contingent and apologetic at the time, if he'd said, yes, we have to do this, I mean, I was a lockdown opponent, so I didn't even buy that, but leave that argument aside. If he said, yes, we're going to have to do this, but you know what? Every day in lockdown is going to add a week to our recovery. Let's do this with our eyes open. Maybe it would have been different, but he didn't. It's just not how he does. He doesn't do contingent apologetic. And he was, massive fiscal firepower of the Treasury, and more generous furlough scheme in Germany or France or Ireland. It's then very, very difficult to say, no, when people then say, well, but why don't you pay my energy bills? Why don't you pay my mortgage? It's much, much harder, right? So, yes, we do need to do that. There are also, however, major structural reforms that need to happen. Even if the outcome is to get the government out of the way of something, that still requires significant change. So a list picked, more or less at random. The worker to pensioner ratio is utterly unsustainable. We cannot carry on with a triple lock and without raising the state pension age. At some point, governments are going to have to tackle that. Having lost half of you on the councillor thing, I've now lost the other half.
Doing well so far.
But that's not something we can keep deferring. The lack of building. We have not built a reservoir since 1992. We haven't built a nuclear power station since 1995. Numbers at Heathrow Airport have been static since 2000, and houses have fallen as a share of the population since the 60s. I mean, these are not sustainable. We have to tackle the debt crisis. Our national debt is now 100% of GDP, and that's without including the PFI debt, the student loans, and the public sector pension liabilities. Right? These are, whichever party is in office, these things cannot be endlessly postponed. Ayn Rand had this nice phrase: you can evade reality, but you cannot evade the consequences of evading reality. Right? And so these things eventually are going to catch us up. Now, like I say, a political party. When people say, why don't the Tories make the case for these things? Well, the honest answer is, yes, they should, but no one believes that a politician is giving you a disinterested analysis. When a politician says these things, it's assumed to be tendentious by most voters. And that's why we need the wider ecosystem. That's why we need a family of groups that are not allied or formally tied to us, but that share the analysis that the state is too big and that the government's approach needs to change. So, you know, the rise of the US Republican Party in the 90s was largely accomplished because it nestled within this much bigger penumbra of conservative organizations that were not affiliated to it, but that made its arguments. And I'm not just talking about, you know, Fox News or talk radio. I'm talking about homeschool associations, gun clubs, evangelical churches, taxpayer groups. Now, obviously, that's a US example. What are the British equivalents going to be under this government? Well, I think sooner or later there is going to be some kind of consumer reaction against the rises in energy costs and taxes if Labour is actually going to attempt this absurd impossibility of a decarbonised grid by 2030. Right? I don't think we don't want, gas users for the Conservatives. We just want consumer groups there making the argument for us. I think there will be people arguing for the maintenance of the Blair Gove reforms in education rather than the rewriting of the curriculum in a woke fashion. I think there will be teachers and heads who may not be conservatives, certainly wouldn't want to be officially called conservatives, but who want a small c conservative education system, by which I mean one that is focused on core skills. There are people in the NHS who can understand that we are spending more and more for less and less good outcomes, and that we need to make structural reforms. Again, you don't want doctors for conservative doctors or whatever. You just want people making that argument. And that, I think, is an absolutely critical part of our recovery. So this is very exciting. It's the first time I've had a party job ever, really. But the current chairman, God bless him, Richard Fuller, has asked me to look at how do we make these alliances either with friendly groups or people who march alongside us, or with groups that are independent of politics, but that have useful ideas to feed in. And I think that's a more modern way of organising a party than what we do at the moment. At present, we have a geographical association-based structure, which, yes, definitely has a place. No, I mean, I'm not saying that we should scrap it at all. We should increase it and recruit more members. But fundamentally, that hasn't changed really since Salisbury's time. I mean, certainly not since Churchill's. In a largely online age, I think there is much more space for these sectional interest groups that are broadly on our side. And I say that as one of the founders of Vote Leave. We very deliberately picked that model. We had doctors for Britain and lawyers for Britain and Muslims for Britain and Jamaicans for Britain and students for Britain and fishermen for Britain and so on. That's the kind of way that you can get people speaking to and for different constituencies. And if I can say one slightly critical thing of our party now, already in opposition, I think our critical tone over some obvious Labour failings risks coming across as a bit unstatesmanlike. I want these things to be said, right? I really, really want people to be pointing out the hypocrisy and the double standards of this government. I'd rather it wasn't us. So who are the allied groups who will be taken more seriously when they make the criticism, rather than, well, of course you're going to say that because you're the opposition, right? That's the challenge.
That's strategy, not tactics. That's very smart. Yeah, absolutely right. This role, I mean, Richard's doing a great job. He was actually there on the stands and handed me my pass, which I thought was dedication to duty.
I think he's
really
there
till the 2nd of November.
Yeah.
How will you? What is the objective? It's 5 weeks, so
yes.
you're going to sit
the objective
down
is to have a folder ready to present to whoever becomes leader at the beginning of November. So we're not going to do a policy review, but we're going to say this is how to do it. This is how we suggest going about it. But I do think Richard has earned himself a promotion. I mean, he's been.
Well, I asked him, does he want the job?
Yeah. Well, I mean, who doesn't, right? In opposition, I mean, guys, heaven knows that's not for me. But in opposition, I would say this: party chairman is the second most important job.
Uh,
That's not always recognised. People would rather be foreign secretary or whatever. They're making a huge mistake. Being shadow foreign secretary is a rubbish job. Being party chairman, you actually run something, right? And for that reason, it is way, way too important, if anyone from any of the leadership campaigns is in here, it is way too important to trade it away for somebody's vote.
Yeah.
Right? There's loads of other baubles that you can do. We all know how it works, but that is not one of them. That's a really, really critical job where you need somebody who has executive ability, who can run organizations, who knows how to fundraise, who knows how to communicate to the grassroots, and who can draw in new members.
Also, with 121 MPs, it's the one job you can give to someone who isn't an MP.
And maybe you should. And maybe you should, because, I'm not saying it can't be done by an MP. Plainly it can and has been. But it must never be somebody's second job. And the life of an MP these days is a very time-consuming one.
You don't want to do it, do you?
No.
I had to ask since you're here.
I have a family to support.
That's the problem, though. I keep asking you, I can name names who would be extremely good at it, and they say, well, no. And someone's got to step up, because I think we've both written that the chairman job is the second, but certainly in this early
I was
stage.
21 years in Brussels, my lad. I've served my debt to society.
I'm conscious of the fact that we're very close to when you said you had to leave, although I'm sure the audience would like you to
we can keep going.
We're good. One of my favourite moments, I have worked for the old Quango, I have to admit, but I did work briefly for a think tank, and I was chairing a panel. This is 2017 maybe. Dan is on the panel and does this passionate defence of capitalism. And since, one of the reasons for doing this is basically give us your greatest hits. Your defence of capitalism, where capitalism become a dirty word, was inspiring and fantastic to listen to, and I think intimidated all the other panel. It was like, literally follow that. Why? Is it just such a no-brainer to you? Because those people who don't like it say, well, the problem is there's always losers, and the losers can be perpetual losers in that system. Why is free trade, capitalism, the model that you would literally fight in a ditch to defend?
Would you rather be one of those losers in North Korea or South Korea? Right? Would you rather be poor or scruffy, dissident, hippie, anti-growth type in East Germany or West Germany? I mean, it logically, I think it is so obvious that markets make everybody better off, and especially raise the standard of living of the poorest people. However, that is counterintuitive, and I mean that in the literal sense. We are a tribal species, we evolved in kin groups, and the idea of depending on strangers for invisible stuff does not come naturally. And this basically genetic indisposition manifests itself in every generation as, why are we so materialistic? Why are we so greedy? Why are we so soulless? Aren't there higher values? Sure, of course there are. But there's no need to make ourselves poorer to make a point, right? I mean, one of the biggest misapprehensions that I think the people outside this room have about, or outside this hall have about the people in it, is that they genuinely think that all we care about is the bank balance. That all Tories are just somehow, motivated only by the bottom line. I don't think I've ever met such a person. I don't think I've ever met, and I've been coming to Tory conference since Brighton in 1992, I don't think I've ever met anyone who gets more satisfaction from a healthy bank balance than from having a nice walk in the countryside, or listening to a Beethoven symphony, or playing with your children. But the rises in living standards made possible by market capitalism are what allow us to do all of those things. Right? Because you've now got a dishwasher and you don't have to wash all the dishes by hand, you have time to go for that walk in the country. Because you can drive to work and don't have to take several different trams, you've got time to listen to that Beethoven symphony. And because you don't have to spend 7 days a week just providing food for your kids, you've got the weekend to play with them, right? So it's a really constant battle to keep telling people this, because as I say, it's counterintuitive.
If it's so obvious, why is it so hard to persuade people? Because there are a lot of people very locked into that whole attitude that, and this also goes to the fact that I do have friends who are in Labour, and I like, you always think I'm a Tory because I'm some kind of contrarian, that there is an established natural place to be in politics, and I've just decided I'm going to be awkward and choose the other side. You must have had this.
This is not new. Bill Buckley, the great editor, he said, the Liberals are always talking about the other point of view, but deep down they can't believe there is another point of view. And I think we're all familiar with some people like that, aren't we? We all have friends who match that.
I went to a book launch. Forgive me for this one. I went to a book launch the other week, and the author was obviously slightly left-leaning, but happens to be married to a Tory. He said, I'd take some advice my father gave me was vote Labour, sleep Tory.
Yeah. Well, I think the originator of that line was Oswald Mosley.
Right, okay, fine. I might tell her that. She might drop it as a bomb from her repertoire. But that idea, we've both been making that case to people we know for a long time. It's hard work, and if it's that obvious, why is it such hard work?
I mean, it is harder work after the pandemic, again, because we were thrown back on those caveman heuristics, and we became more illogical and more inward-looking and so on. But I mean, so I flew here yesterday from I was making a speech in Virginia at a thing called the Philadelphia Society, which was set up as the original kind of fusionist Reaganite coalition. So it was the thing that brought together the foreign policy hawks and the moral conservatives and the free marketeers. And I thought, if anyone is still going to be receptive to a pro-market and pro-trade message, even in the age of Trump, it's going to be these guys. You know, they were founded by Milton Friedman and Bill Buckley and so on. And so I made such a speech as you just recalled, and almost every conversation I had afterwards was a variant of, I loved all that, except for your thing about tariffs. We must have tariffs. Now, this is the impact that Trump has had on the entire right. But the reason he's had it is because tariffs are intuitive. Tariffs speak to the inner caveman, not to the reasoning modern human being. You know, it's one of those things that seems to stand to reason until you actually observe what it does, which is that it causes needless poverty, especially to the people who were worst off in the first place. But, you know, I found during the lockdown, it was much harder to make that case even to people who'd previously been more sympathetic. Oh, surely, Hannon, even you now understand why we need to grow our own food. You know, really? Really? That's what you got from it? Do you know, the lockdown started at the end of March. Any farmers here? Those of you in agriculture will know that the end of March is the beginning of our hungry gap, right? We finished the winter harvest. We're not producing any more cabbages and turnips and potatoes. We haven't started the main harvest. Late March to early May, which was the lockdown, had we tried to be self-sufficient, we would have been eating rhubarb and asparagus and maybe a bit of nettle soup, right? That's what we produced at that time of year. Fortunately, the global market functioned extremely well. And other than some panic buying at the beginning, it all regulated itself very quickly. But that is never, facts are never going to convince people who have started with that prejudice and reasoned backwards. And so there's a constant argument. And by the way, we're seeing now how necessary it is to have this argument generationally. Things that I suppose most of you in this room stopped thinking about because they're so obvious are not at all obvious to the present government. I thought Labour would engage in some economic populism and would make noises about rent controls and price controls, you know, but it's much worse than that. I think they actually believe this stuff. The Chancellor seems genuinely nonplussed at the idea that if you raise taxes sufficiently on non-doms, they might not just sit around waiting to be taxed, and that you might end up with less revenue than you had before. She genuinely appears quite shocked by this discovery. Now, why did nobody tell me before? Kind of, you know? And I bet you the same thing is going to happen with our decision to have become the only country in the developed world not to treat education as a public good. We're the only. Everywhere else, people say, if you're letting the state off having to educate your kids, thank you very much. That's great. How do we make it easier for you? We uniquely, the only country in the world, in the modern world, are taxing it. Now, again, yes, Labour have factored in the cost of some kids having to be found spaces in the state system. What they haven't looked at, and I don't think they recognise the concept, is the secondary or dynamic effect. Once people no longer have to pay school fees because they've given up and put their kids in the state system, why assume that they're going to carry on working the same hours? Why assume they're going to put in the same amount of overtime? In quite a few cases, they're not. Right? The Adam Smith Institute, as far as I know, done the only attempt to quantify this, and they thought that the loss in tax revenue would be between 1.8, if I remember this, 1.8 and 2.6 billion. Well, that would wipe out all the savings and more, right? But again, we have to keep having the idea that, Ed Miliband, his first act in government is to ban new oil and gas drilling in the North Sea. And then 2 weeks ago, he turns around in I think, genuine perplexity and says, I'm deeply disappointed to see the closure of the Grangemouth refinery. What do you think is going to happen? And by the way, this goes way beyond oil and gas, right? Once you go down the road towards retrospective confiscatory taxation, people in every sector stop investing, and you have to pay a premium. Now, all of these things were arguments that we thought we had won in the 80s. And to a degree we had. I think everything I've just said, Tony Blair would have acknowledged, right? He may have not liked it and he may have found ways of packaging it, but he would have recognised the fundamental truth. Right? These guys, it may just be that nobody has been making the argument for a long time and that they've therefore kind of defaulted to our DNA-based prejudices. But it's not that they've turned their back on free market economics, it's that they've turned their back on economics. They genuinely think that they can suspend all of these laws. And we're going to find out the hard way as a country that you can't.
You can see why I always enjoy my conversations with Dan. I'm so glad we could share this one with you. And to another 10 years, if you will, writing for Conservative Home. Always grateful for your contributions. I hope you enjoyed this. We could have gone on a lot longer. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you, Dan.